Less than 1%. That's how much of the curcumin in a piece of fresh turmeric root actually reaches the bloodstream once it's eaten raw or swallowed as a capsule. The rest passes straight through the body, unused. That number comes from a peer-reviewed pharmacology study on curcumin absorption, not a marketing claim. Now picture that same root, sliced into a jar of salt water instead. In a clinical trial of 214 people, a specific strain from the same broad family of bacteria found in an old salt brine ferment left most patients rating their results excellent or good after 4 weeks, compared to almost none of the group on a placebo. That trial used a targeted probiotic capsule, not a homemade jar, but the same broad family of bacteria shows up naturally in old-fashioned salt brine ferments. Put those two facts side by side, and a plain jar sitting on a shelf starts to look more interesting than most of what's sold in a pharmacy aisle. That is the claim of this video. Not a miracle, not a shortcut. A forgotten household system that a certain kind of household never let go of. Somewhere along the way, the pharmacy shelf replaced the pantry shelf, the bottle replaced the jar, and a whole system that families once relied on quietly disappeared from most American kitchens. But not from every kitchen. In many Amish households, this system stayed in daily use. Amish families generally relied less on a monthly trip to the store and more on what could be grown, stored, and kept alive right there on the property. A root cellar instead of a pharmacy aisle. A crock instead of a capsule bottle. A jar that keeps working long after the harvest is over. This is the part most people forgot. Fermenting fresh root vegetables like ginger and turmeric does not just preserve them, it changes them. It makes what is already inside that root easier for the body to actually use. Not something new added in. Something already there. Finally unlocked. Picture a root cellar for a moment. Cool air, dim light, coming through one small window near the ceiling. Wood shelves lined with glass jars, row after row, some pale, some darker, all holding something that took almost no money and almost no equipment to make. For many Amish families, this room did the job a pharmacy aisle does for most people today. It held what the household needed to get through a cold season without depending on a store run every few weeks. This is not a claim that every Amish family did the exact same thing in the exact same way. Some leaned more on dried herbs. Some leaned more on root cellars. Some leaned on both. But the root cellar mindset, the idea that health support should live in the house, not in a shopping bag, runs through Amish household life in a way that is easy to see and hard to miss. The grocery store sold convenience. The Amish pantry kept a habit, and that habit is worth understanding because the science behind it holds up. Start with the frustration most people already feel without naming it. A bottle of turmeric capsules costs money every single month. A jar of dried ginger sits in the spice cabinet losing strength the longer it sits there. And somewhere in the back of a person's mind is the nagging feeling that swallowing a capsule once a day is not really doing very much. That feeling is not imagination. Fresh turmeric and fresh ginger both contain compounds the body has a hard time absorbing on their own. The root can be full of good material and still pass through the body without much of it actually being used. That is the real limitation. Not that the plant lacks power, that the body struggles to unlock it. Here is where the old method comes back in. When ginger and turmeric are placed into a proper salt brine and left to ferment, natural bacteria already present on the root begin to work. These bacteria break down some of the tougher compounds in the root into smaller, simpler forms. Smaller forms are easier for the body to absorb. That is the entire mechanism in plain terms. Nothing mystical, nothing invented, a natural process breaking material down into something more usable. This is the same basic bacteria at work in a jar of sauerkraut or a crock of pickles. It is not a special or secret culture. It is the same everyday fermentation that Amish households have used for generations to preserve cabbage, cucumbers, and other vegetables through the colder months. The difference here is simply where that process gets pointed. Instead of only preserving a vegetable, it is being used to unlock a root that supports the body. That is the difference between a recipe and a system. A recipe makes one dish. A system runs a household. Now picture the kitchen table, not the cellar, for the actual preparation. This is where the work starts, and it starts smaller than most people expect. The first thing Amish kitchens did differently was never rely on dried spice jars sitting untouched in a cabinet. Dried ginger and dried turmeric lose a good deal of what makes the fresh root useful in the first place. Drying stops spoilage, but it also strips away moisture and activity the fermentation process depends on. So the starting material matters. Fresh ginger root, fresh turmeric root, not the jar of yellow powder that has been sitting in the spice rack since who knows when. The second part is smaller than most beginners expect, and it is also where most people get it wrong without realizing it. Salt. Most people who try fermenting at home make the same mistake. They measure salt against the water alone. That sounds reasonable, but it is not accurate, because the root vegetables themselves carry a great deal of water inside their own cells. Once that water begins to release into the brine, it dilutes the salt level lower than intended. A brine that started strong enough can end up too weak to do its job properly. The correct approach measures salt against the combined weight of the water and the root together, not the water by itself. This is sometimes called an equilibrium brine, but the name matters far less than the habit. Weigh the water, weigh the root. Add the salt based on both combined. That single adjustment is the difference between a safe, steady ferment and one that goes soft, weak, or unpredictable. This is not a complicated formula. It does not require a chemistry background. It requires a kitchen scale and a habit of measuring both parts together instead of guessing. The third part involves the water and the salt itself, and this is where a small detail quietly makes a big difference. Tap water often carries chlorine, and chlorine can slow down or even stop the natural bacteria the whole process depends on. Letting water sit uncovered for a day, or briefly boiling it and letting it cool, removes much of that chlorine before it ever reaches the jar. Salt matters just as much. Iodized table salt contains iodine, and iodine works against the same bacteria the ferment is trying to encourage. Plain sea salt or rock salt, without iodine added, keeps that bacteria free to do its work. None of this is complicated. It is simply detail that got lost once packaged. Iodized salt and treated tap water became the default in most modern kitchens. The fourth part concerns the jar itself, and this is where the Amish crock tradition offers a clear lesson. A tightly sealed jar traps the gas that naturally builds up during fermentation. Trapped gas creates pressure. Pressure creates problems. Sometimes a cracked jar, sometimes a mess on the counter. Amish households traditionally use stoneware crocks with loose-fitting lids, sometimes weighted down with a clean stone or a smaller vessel filled with water. The goal was never a perfect seal. The goal was keeping the vegetables submerged under the brine, while still allowing gas to escape safely. A modern jar with a loosely set lid, or a proper fermentation weight, follows that same old logic. The fifth part is about where the jar sits while it works, and this is one of the clearest points of contrast between a modern kitchen and an old one. A warm kitchen counter speeds fermentation up, sometimes too much, leading to an uneven or overly sour result. A root cellar, or any cool, steady space, slows the process down and lets it happen more evenly. Cold does not stop fermentation completely. It slows the activity down. That single fact is why root cellars work so well for Amish households long before refrigeration existed in most homes. A steady, cool space did the same basic job a refrigerator does today, just slower and without electricity. The sixth part is about knowing when the jar is actually ready, and here is where most beginners rely on the wrong signal. Watching the calendar and guessing by the number of days is not reliable, because temperature changes how quickly the process moves. A warmer kitchen finishes faster. A cooler cellar takes longer. The better signal is watching and smelling and tasting in small amounts along the way, small bubbles rising through the brine. A fresh, slightly tangy smell instead of anything sharp or unpleasant. A taste that has shifted from raw and sharp toward something rounder and more mellow. Those signs matter more than any single number of days on a calendar. The seventh part is the one people tend to skip, and it is just as important as everything that came before it. Even once the jar is ready, the smart approach is starting with small amounts, not a large serving all at once. Fermented foods affect different people differently. Some people tolerate them easily. Others feel bloated, flushed, or uncomfortable, especially with foods that sit for a longer fermentation period. This is not a flaw in the method. It is simply a fact about how bodies vary. A small daily amount lets a person notice how their own body responds before building up to more. That single habit, starting small and paying attention, prevents most of the discomfort people associate with fermented foods in general. It is worth being clear about one more thing here, since it comes up often in conversations about fermented food. Black garlic is sometimes talked about as though it were a fermented product. but that is not accurate. Black garlic is made through a slow cooking and caramelizing process, using heat and humidity over several weeks, not through the bacterial fermentation described in this video. It is a genuinely useful ingredient in its own right, but it belongs to a different process entirely, and it is not part of the method being described here. Now step back into the root cellar for a moment, because this is where the entire system comes together. Amish pantry life was never built around bottles that expire on a shelf or capsules bought once a month and then forgotten in a cabinet. It was built around a rotating system of jars and crocks, refilled from the garden, stored in a space that required no electricity, and used according to what the season and the body actually called for. Low waste fit naturally into that life, not as a trend, but as a simple household necessity. Nothing was thrown away that could still be used. Root vegetables that might otherwise spoil in a matter of days could instead be turned into something that lasted for weeks or longer, packed with more usable nutrition than they started with. A vegetable heading toward the compost pile became, instead, something worth keeping on a shelf. That is the real difference between a modern pantry and an Amish one. A modern kitchen often treats food as something to be used quickly or lost. An Amish kitchen treated food as something to be extended, stretched, and turned into more than it started as. The same logic applies here with ginger and turmeric. A batch of fresh root, likely to spoil within a week or two sitting on a counter, becomes instead a jar that keeps for a much longer stretch of time, sitting quietly on a cellar shelf, ready whenever it is needed. This is also where the cost comparison becomes hard to ignore. A bottle of turmeric capsules from a store shelf comes with a price tag that repeats every single month. A jar of fermented root, made from a small amount of fresh ginger, fresh turmeric, water, and salt, costs a fraction of that, and it comes from ingredients many people can grow themselves or find easily at almost any grocery store. This is not a claim that the capsule bottle on the shelf is worthless or dangerous. It is simply a fact about dependence. One system requires a repeat purchase every month, indefinitely. The other requires a jar, a little planning, and a cellar shelf, or even a cool corner of a kitchen cupboard if a cellar is not available. Here is what most people forgot somewhere along the way. The old method was never about doing something fancy or unusual. It was about not depending on a store for something a kitchen could make on its own. That is the real heart of the Amish approach to food and health. Not a mystical secret, not a hidden formula the world was trying to keep quiet. A practical, repeatable household habit, passed along not through written recipes, but through daily practice, kitchen to kitchen, cellar to cellar. The old way was not complicated. It required attention, not equipment. It required patience, not money. And it worked well enough that entire households built their pantry systems around it for generations. None of this means the fermentation jar replaces medical care or medication a person may need. It means a simple, low-cost household habit exists that many people have simply never been shown. A jar, a root, a proper brine, a cool space, and enough patience to let time do the work it was always going to do anyway. So here is the practical recap, stripped down to what actually matters. Start with fresh ginger and fresh turmeric root, not dried spice from the cabinet. Measure salt against the combined weight of the water and the root together, not the water alone. Use plain, non-iodized salt and water that has had its chlorine removed by sitting out or by boiling and cooling. Keep the vegetables submerged under the brine with a loosely fitted lid or a proper weight, allowing gas to escape safely. Store the jar somewhere cool and steady, like a cellar shelf or a cool cupboard, rather than a warm kitchen counter. Judge readiness by bubbles, smell, and taste, rather than the calendar alone. And start with small amounts once it is ready, paying attention to how the body responds before eating more. Put next to a bottle bought new every month. A jar built from a few dollars of root, salt, and water tells a very different story about cost and about waste. One system asks a person to keep buying. The other asks a person to keep a small habit going. A full cellar shelf lined with jars will always outlast a grocery bag brought home once a week. If someone is the kind of person who would rather fill a shelf with jars they made themselves than fill a cabinet with bottles that need replacing every month, this old Amish approach to root fermentation is worth trying, one small jar at a time. Many families still remember some version of this, even if fermentation itself was never mentioned by name. A grandmother who kept a crock going in the cellar. A mother who never let a batch of vegetables go to waste at the end of the season. A pantry shelf that always seemed to have one more jar tucked in the back, saved for exactly the right moment. If any of that sounds familiar, it is worth sharing in the comments. Did a mother or grandmother keep a bread starter, a crock, a pantry jar, or a food habit nobody in the house was ever allowed to throw away? For anyone interested in more of these old household systems, the kind that quietly ran Amish kitchens for generations, while the rest of the country moved toward store shelves and monthly deliveries, subscribing keeps these videos coming. The next video moves from the root cellar to the bread box, looking at how Amish households kept a starter alive with far less feeding than most beginners think is necessary, and how that habit alone kept flour from ever going to waste in the first place. A jar, a little salt, a little patience. That is the whole system. And it has been sitting quietly in Amish root cellars this entire time, waiting for someone to bring it back into an ordinary kitchen.